Welcome to Clydebuilt Conversations. Today's guest is Sam Worthington, CEO of InterAction. Sam is an expert on international humanitarian and development and has been a leader in the nonprofit and charitable sectors for decades. We spoke in Washington, D.C. Sam Worthington, thank you so much for taking time with Clydebuilt Conversations. We do appreciate you taking time out of your day and your busy schedule, and we appreciate your contributions to this conversation on leadership and a variety of policy issues, so thank you so much.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to chat with you. I appreciate this chance to share some thoughts.
I wanted to start about 25 years ago, a story that I've heard you speak about and write about related to southern India many years ago, about 25 years ago, when you encountered a young malnourished girl in southern India related to growing peanuts on a roof and how that informed your career and the direction. Could you describe that story?
I'd been exposed to poverty in Latin America growing up, but I didn't know or hadn't witnessed severely malnourished children. And at this time was something called the Child Survival Revolution, was this discovery that through a number of interventions we could actively help save the lives of children to ensure that they made it through those first 5 years of life where they were more likely to die. And I was in southern India, and we'd driven for hours into rural areas and into a very poor village and then stopped. And then behind that village was a hamlet of Dalit, the untouchables, where this community was living. And there was an active, I was with a doctor from Nigeria, an active child survival program. And throughout the day, it was hot and dusty. This young girl who was probably the age of my daughter at the time, but who was, maybe half the size, clearly malnourished. But she was curious. She didn't know who this stranger was in her village. She would glance at me. She would I could notice her paying attention. And at the end of the day, I was tired. I sat down and pumped some water out of a hand pump that we'd installed, and was sitting there, and all of a sudden got a tap on my shoulder, and here's this young girl sort of reaching out her hand to guide me somewhere. Wasn't sure at first what to do, so I stood up, and she sort of motioned me, and we walked across the center of the village to the one building that was made out of concrete, and there were stairs that went up the outside with no railing, and she scampered up to the top, and I followed her up to the roof, and there in the sun, drying, was a field of peanuts. And she went up and scooped down and grabbed a handful of peanuts and fed me. And the idea that she thought I must be hungry after a long day of no food, that a stranger, that there had to be some form of hospitality, that there was some emotive relationship of wanting to help someone. But it completely flipped on its head, this idea that here I am, this person from the United States with resources coming to help, to having a child who herself was malnourished on her own take the initiative to feed me. And it reversed the whole concept of, well, who's helping whom here, and where does power lie, and what do we do when we as human beings emote and care for each other and each other's well-being. And the reality that if a child that is malnourished can spend time wanting to feed you, that we really need to approach development from a different light. And in many ways, it's informed the rest of my career.
And we've talked about your wonderful family, your 3 kids, your wife, and let's talk about a bit your parents and how, in addition to that very, very powerful, poignant story, which is just poetic, it's beautiful. How did your parents instill this idea of service in you or international engagement?
Well, my father was, I guess, first in the Kennedy White House, and then was posted as a diplomat on the Kennedy round as a negotiator in Geneva. So at age 5, I was overseas, and they've ended up staying overseas ever since. So by the time I was in my late teens, I'd lived on 3 continents in 5 countries. So the concept of a different culture, different norms, and many times I attended local school and ended up with multiple languages. The idea that the world was complex and that you couldn't just simply impose ideas on it and so forth. And it was really in Venezuela, living there, when I began to witness this gap between what it was like to live an expatriate life and the barrios on the hillside. And my father had encouraged me to, go and experience this. And, we want to go end up working in a factory in one of the poorer parts of town and spending time in the barrios. And I found it distressing because it wasn't a reality that I knew. To see children sniffing glue, to see children in the streets, and yet return to affluence. And this sense that I got from my family that let's look at the whole of society, not just how we're doing, ultimately led me down the path of I should work for the UN or a government, but then slowly discovered this concept that there are nonprofits who are dedicated to doing that, and that launched me in this direction.
And you had worked for NGOs and nonprofits prior to your role, of course, here at InterAction as president and CEO. What were you doing just before you came to InterAction?
I was with a global nonprofit called Plan International as the U.S. CEO, and it's again, it was focused on children, and we were working in 62 countries. The idea that we had individuals across the U.S. who were sponsors, who most of our resources came from the generosity directly of the American people, and it gave me a sense that this is not an abstraction of simply resources come and you do projects, but that there is this connection that individuals in this country and others have with wanting to do something positive in the world, even if it is as small as helping a child. And then on the other side, realizing that we weren't just helping a child, but that you were partnering with a village and a community and engaging with them over 10, 15 years, looking at the health system, looking at education, the habitat, the environment they're in, doing very concrete things to improve the life of a child, not through a handout, but through meeting a community halfway, where if there was need to build a school, they would build the school with resources we provided. They would negotiate to get teachers and so forth. And it reaffirmed this lesson I learned in India, that you can meet communities halfway, that nonprofits can play this bridging role, and then at the same time, that there is a deep reservoir of caring that exists within the American population that looks through, whether it's through their faith or through different institutions, ways that they can, in however small way, touch the world. And then I saw that actually in doing that, we could impact literally millions of lives.
And you saw significant growth in the 60s and 70s and 80s of these nonprofit organizations that were engaging in the world to do charitable activities, and you saw that significant growth and more of a sensitivity, as you're describing, with the American public. InterAction, this coalition of organizations, describe the InterAction model and your thoughts in leading this organization. What are the challenges that you experience? And
so you end up with nonprofits that have come out of Catholic Relief Services or World Vision or Islamic Relief or the Save the Children's or Oxfam or CARE, or where I was with Plan International, this diversity of organizations, some of which are sort of household names like Habitat for Humanity and others which are not. all have this desire to shape and be a partner in improving human dignity in other places. And some 30 years ago, they came together looking at, well, how do we coordinate ourselves? How do we have a better collective impact? Are there ways that we could learn and so forth? And this led to the founding of InterAction. And we're not a household name because we're behind the scenes. We're where the leadership of all these different nonprofits come together. So if there is a disaster in the world, this is the place where they come together to coordinate, or if they need to influence the UN or others. And the challenge here is someone goes, you have 200 or so CEO bosses, is how do you herd these cats and get them going in a common direction? And the reality, it's not by standing out front and saying, follow me, but it is rooted in the idea that behind each of these traditions, there are some very common principles. They all want, in their own way, to advance human dignity. They all see the potential that exists in human beings to have a better future in life. And by aligning people around ideas, you can get groups of 30 or 40 nonprofits to take a position. And so the challenge is both the patience to get this alignment, and at the heart of it is the trust that they must have in InterAction, and in my case, in my leadership, in guiding, shaping, and helping the community try to achieve things that they couldn't do on their own, but could only do as a collective.
I've heard you describe it as being a director of an orchestra, that it's a chorus of voices, and yet coming together with that crystal clear voice. Is it an apt analogy that you feel in this role, that you are directing a choir of voices? And
I think it's part of it is, and the answer is yes, it's sort of a conductor, and realizing that it's not your voice, that it's their voices, that the power of the collective comes through allowing each individual nonprofit to shape their own ideas, to be true to their identity. If you're the Nature Conservancy, you're focused on the environment. If you're Lutheran World Relief, you're focusing on individuals in development settings, or if you're Mercy Corps, you're very much focusing on humanitarian settings. Each organization brings their own culture and norms, and yet they all know that there are times when they could achieve things together that they can't do alone. And so it's the requirement of having a platform that is neutral, that is value-based but neutral, that isn't bent towards one organization or the other, so you can't play favorites, but you do challenge them and say, all right, we need to achieve the following. And an example of this would be there was a G8 meeting that President Obama the U.S. was the head of this G8 meeting here in the U.S., and the White House was looking for something in the development field that they could bring to the G8. And we looked around and saw that the World Health Organization had some interesting work on how could you stop stunting for 50 million children in the world. And so we challenged the White House, why don't you pick this up? But then the challenge within InterAction is, can we get 60 or 70 nonprofits all to talk about nutrition in children, even if that wasn't the central thing that they were interested in? And to convince them that by doing this, we might be able to persuade the White House to pick this up, which the White House did. It ended up becoming part of the G8 agenda. It was then approved. But there was no resources behind this. And then the next challenge was to go back to these same nonprofits and say, well, could we pitch resources in to focus on children nutrition? And we ended up having some 30 or more organizations contributing $750 million of nonprofit money, which then helped spur a donor conference in the United Kingdom, and ultimately some $4.2 billion were raised to help reduce stunting of 50 million children. So
Remarkable.
you could achieve things in these collectives. And again, it wasn't us. It was multiple organizations coming together, but we were the vehicle that they used
Yes.
to achieve these things.
And in the absence of interaction, it would have been very difficult for an achievement of that goal.
And the challenge is that you can't do it on the fly. There has to be, the trust has to be there. What we find on a daily basis is, whether it's a problem in Gaza, or you're working in Syria, or right now we're talking a lot about Yemen, you have individuals in these nonprofits who are spending days working with each other to try to resolve problems that they can't do on their own, and we're the place where they do a lot of that work.
So I encourage listeners to go to interaction.org. The website is terrific. Lots of information about the history that Sam is describing, but also updated material, a wealth of information from individual members, who the members are, links to their pages. So the interaction.org website is, I think, one of the best because it's a repository of information. So I really compliment you and the staff with that. Your approach to leadership, as you know, we're trying to focus in on qualities of leadership as part of this series. How would you describe your approach to leadership? How would you describe you as a leader?
Well, it was many ways influenced by how I grew up. I was this funny term called third culture kid, which again, I'd lived in multiple cultures, multiple norms, and I found myself, when working at Plan International, in a situation where I couldn't control the global organization. No one could. You were in a meeting, sometimes there were 27 different nationalities in the meeting, and I'd be the one American. And how do you persuade your colleagues in Japan, in Germany, in Brazil, and in India to agree on a common position? And found myself emerging in a sort of chair role of the different CEOs within this global organization, of moving them, because I wasn't right out there with my own agenda. If I had led with the sense of, this is what I want you to do, I'd be one more interest group sort of wrestling for an outcome. But it was trusting that the group itself would come up with conclusions if we asked the right questions, and if we explored it deeply enough, would be probably not that different than where I thought it needed to go. And that, to me, was interesting training to come to InterAction, where there is no direct power over, what will Save the Children do, or CARE do, and so forth. But they look to us as a place where they're looking for validation, as a place where we could hold up a mirror and say, here are some problems that you need to address. And if it's done in a way where they feel they have their own voice in shaping it, we could introduce, and I can introduce, some concepts that actually will change the behavior of how organizations look at themselves. So whether it's dealing with a challenge of how do you deal with sexual harassment and abuse in organizations, and what do you do about that, or how do you become more effective in responding to a humanitarian emergency, or when do we say no to the U.S. government, this is not a good policy, you're harming people. Each of those requires this sort of confidence that the collective around you will come up with the right answer, but it is not simply, let's go for the lowest common denominator of a group. At a certain point, you're saying, if you can't agree, if you can't move this, here's where I'll go. And so you're pushing the group to come up with a direction, and sometimes challenging them to try new things. And that happens because they have trust, and that trust has been earned over years.
So your leadership qualities really have blossomed in this role. Coming into the role, you had that natural proclivity to be that type of leader, and then even grew in this position. You've been here for many, many years. it suited your leadership style, the model of InterAction.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting. I remember some colleagues from Plan said, "You, Sam, you found the perfect job for you," and in many ways, I have, because there's an idealistic side to my leadership, a sense that a belief that U.S. nonprofits can be more than their individual parts, that the sum could add up to something greater, and by sort of holding up that idealism of you could do better. I found that I'll be meeting with some 70 CEOs in a retreat next week. I found that colleagues want that. They want to imagine something larger. They want to dream that they could do something more. And they also want to know that they're not alone in this enterprise, that you're not just there pushing against global poverty or responding to endless crises, but that you have colleagues who are doing the same thing, and that you're part of a community that cares in very much the same way that you do.
Do you feel the quality of leadership that you're describing, both in yourself, and I know that you've seen it in others, and maybe even tried to model your leadership style after others that you've experienced in your career and personally, do you feel that is lacking right now in our society more generally, this quality of unification, of coalition building, of bringing people together, of disparate views, and is that a quality that's lacking in our culture?
In many ways, we've played up our differences, and we've played up the sort of, I need to take care of myself in this world, and that is how I get ahead and find happiness. And within this nonprofit community, it's not that people don't argue and don't have very big differences, and some of them are not reconcilable, but there is this sense that there's a purpose beyond oneself to achieve something in the world, and that by having that purpose, and it's not a starry-eyed one, in these roles, I've seen people, thousands of people dying of HIV/AIDS, or war zones where buildings are blown apart and so forth. But in each of the environments, you see the potential of humanity to do something, and being in a place where people have that higher purpose, whatever their faith background or their tradition or however they're approaching it, there is this willingness to take on a broader cause. And we, as Americans, have in some ways lost that sense that we can make a difference in our own society and the world, and of some sense of sort of, well, it's either I get it for myself or I protect myself, but I can't imagine a better future for all of us. And that ability to dream is something that we need to reinstill in our society, and look back at the principles that hold us together, because those principles, I have found, whether it's coming from the evangelical side of our community to the very progressive liberal part of our community, are not that different from each other if you spend the time looking for them.
Yeah, I have found through the various interviews with Secretary Baker, who is known for his ability to build coalitions, Secretary Schultz, and Governor Robb, the various people that we've interviewed, it's a common thread that you're describing precisely, this ability to bring people together, but also the desire to do it. And how do you feel the recent political climate has influenced InterAction's priorities, and where do you see a need for the NGO sector leadership as it relates to that political climate?
But in some ways has put us on the defensive, because we're a part of American culture that is inherently global, that wants to do and help people, and our members do lots of programs here in the United States, disaster relief and in poor areas of this country. But they are also focused overseas, this idea that we have a responsibility as a very affluent country to make a difference in the broader world. and that it's healthy for our society to engage globally. And when you have pressures pushing in the opposite direction of let's take care just of ourselves, let's forget the outside world, let's retrench, it's a zero-sum game. And the reality of our lived experience, it is not a zero-sum game, that you can, by helping someone in another place, increase trade, increase interest in the U.S., you can make the world a more peaceful place. So that sense, we've had to fall back onto some principles, and these are not principles that are partisan, and this belief that there is a value in a sort of international order of things that forms a compromise are a positive thing to do, that this inherently is good for American society, and that we could do things by taking this approach that you can't do otherwise. An example of this, years ago, we brought together the women's movement, a faith community, and the international development community, and asked them the question of, well, at this point in time, what could you do together? And inevitably, someone threw in the big divisions and societal divisions and cultural divisions on sexuality and other things in the mix there. But eventually, what came out of this, and this was in partnership with the National Cathedral here in Washington, was we wanted to focus on the empowerment of girls. And so you ended up with the, an evangelical leaders standing next to the National Organization of Women talking about how the empowerment of girls was important, again leading to a pledge of $1 billion in a cathedral full of 3,000 people. And people asked the question, well, how did you do this? And it was simply, we said, well, let's look at what we agree on, not what we don't agree on. And that enabled us to achieve something that could not have been done if we were simply focusing on how we were different from each other.
That's fascinating. And within our culture, at least in some sectors, there is a desire to exploit the differences for gain. And that seems to be more of a increasing tactic in terms of promoting an agenda to exploit those differences, unfortunately. And for InterAction, do you feel with the model that you're describing, has there been lasting change that has been created as a result of the InterAction model?
I mean, we've had these successes of, influencing G8, G20 agendas. We've had these successes of large pledges of billions of dollars and so forth. And we've also had to protect the community. And recently, when we've had, parts of Congress and others going after our Muslim-based members, we've, recent attacks on our involving our Jewish founded members. And what's been interesting in this, from all the sadness of that happening within our culture, is the degree to which different organizations of different faiths and different backgrounds have all stood by each other. That they have basically made this point that we are Americans first, that our value in improving lives in working in northern Syria, or in the work I'd done in the past in responding to the AIDS pandemic under President Bush, that this could be better accomplished if you created bridges. And we don't look at this from the vantage point of a party winning or not. And what InterAction has done for 20 years is engage with members of Congress and their staff, and made the idea that U.S. engagement overseas in terms of our values and who and what it means to be Americans is not something that's tied to a political ideology or to one side winning, but is inherently something that is what it means to be Americans in the world. And we've been able to maintain that idealism, recognizing that this is good for national security, recognizing this is also good for trade and so forth. But there is something that is innately moral about these approaches.
What broader role can support for the global development play in our national dialogue as you're describing these attributes? I
mean, the key here for the U.S. is as we engage globally as a country, as a nation, and invest and so forth, I mean, you do get the sort of generals saying that if I didn't, if we didn't do this, I'd have to pay for more ammunition. And there's sort of a hard-nosed side of this, of to what extent is our engagement in the world only through military and so forth. But for the nonprofits, we're sort of stepping back away from this and look at the broader calls of whether it's the Sustainable Development Goals or other broader goals of how do you improve, can one eliminate hunger? Can one stop a disease? Can one help individuals who are displaced? And the answer is, if you stand back and look at it all, it just sounds too big and too impossible. But if you break it down into manageable pieces and different organizations take on different challenges, we have found that in the aftermath of a disaster or in the midst of a war or others, that as a result of all these interventions and local populations, and like this little girl I was talking about giving me peanuts, the world is actually in many ways better off than it's ever been. You have fewer children dying, you have more girls in school, life expectancy is longer than it's ever been, and so the results are real, and our challenge is not to give up on this idea that we can actually improve the welfare and dignity of people.
I was recently at an event for the Lantos Foundation. The Lantos Foundation is in honor of Tom Lantos, a former member of Congress from the San Francisco Bay Area, who was, as you know, very focused on human rights and justice. One of the observations made was that was so central to the agenda, the foreign policy agenda for the United States, to focus on human rights and justice around the world. And for some reason it's been lost from the agenda and the dialogue. Do you feel, we've talked about this development within the NGO sector and how national leaders were in a bipartisan way talking about humanitarian and development engagement with Africa specifically. Do you feel it's been lost from the agenda and the discussion and dialogue, whether that's on Capitol Hill or on the presidential level?
I mean, it's still in Capitol Hill. I mean, it's been interesting in that there's clearly a desire to engage globally across parties, and that has resulted in budget cuts that were made by the Trump administration being reinstated and so forth. But at the level of this administration, we see a pullback. I was in Paris at something called the Paris Peace Forum, which was the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War, and there were 65 heads of state in the room, and some 500 people around it. We met for 2 days. There was no one from the United States, not a single person from the State Department or others there, whereas normally people would be flocking to U.S. leadership around what do we do about global governance, how do we avoid another war or horrors of the 20th century. And in some ways we're seeing an abdication of U.S. leadership, not just in terms of force and power in the world, but there's a moral and rights-based and justice leadership that is here, that people, for all our flaws and all our imperfections as Americans, we have some aspirations of what a rules-based order looks like, what equity and justice looks like, where what can you do about human rights, how can you introduce the idea that citizens should have a voice, that civil society can exist everywhere. And that's not going to change the world overnight, but that core principle has profoundly influenced the world over the last 70 years. And in some ways, we seem to be giving up on that enterprise just as it's becoming a norm outside our own borders.
A Republican or a Democrat seeking a nomination, say a Republican seeking a nomination to be president or a Democrat, do you think it would be radical for either a Democrat or a Republican to say at a debate exactly what you're saying. Wouldn't it unify the party, but also be a opportunity to unify Democrats and Republicans around this specific agenda related to humanitarian development?
I mean, the idea that we believe in democracy, the idea that we believe in the potential of every human, the power of a job to create dignity, the ability of people to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, that there's some inherent values of what we are as Americans. And the idea that they stop at our borders, that they don't influence the rest of the world, or the rest of the world doesn't influence us, is a tremendous gap. And what we found as we've engaged with the American public over the years, and I remember a group of 11 large nonprofits coming together going, how can we get Americans to care about global poverty? And this was in the 1990s, and we ended up pooling our resources and launching a campaign, and found that actually college students cared about this, and then brought in a Irish rock star, Bono, to come in, which ended up coming into founding the One campaign. And now you have 7 or 8 million people who in some way have decided that they want to make this world a better place, and that you can do this. So for the first time, there's a movement in our country around this. Perhaps it is younger, but it is deeply rooted not in one ideological mode or the other, in call it idealistic, but a belief that we can create and shape a better future. And the fact that when people act on that, they actually see that happening, I think makes it so powerful.
To the point where a potential voter would actually, you say a younger person, as they register to vote and think about the role of the United States in the world, that perhaps could be a motivator, whether or not a member of Congress or a presidential candidate is speaking to this very issue, could be a motivator for supporting that candidate.
And what happens is when people sort of use the term foreign assistance, it sounds like this thing that's abstract and so forth. But when you start talking about it in these terms, the reason why Congress across both parties has been so strongly supportive of these types of programs is because people do see themselves of what it means to be an American there. And they also then could draw the lines that this actually improves our national security and makes the world safer. They could draw the connection that this has an impact on our ability to have a thriving economy. So there's a self-interest here, but no matter how conservative or how progressive the member of Congress, there is this sense that yes, one can create a win-win situation in the world. And my fear is if we lose that, not only will people who have tremendous need no longer benefit from our engagement, but we ourselves will be deprived of the potential and hope of what it means to build our own society.
And our society is also, as we think about those who represent our country overseas, certainly we give due credit, rightfully so, to those who serve in the military and serve overseas for periods of time. As I say, we honor all those who serve. Is it perhaps true that we don't fully understand or appreciate all the Americans who serve overseas, whether it's in the foreign service or the development sector or for NGOs who are really serving the lion's share of their career overseas? Do we need to render more respect for them, to say have them throw out a baseball at a baseball game? And should our policy leaders be drawing more attention to the sacrifices that individuals who are in development, humanitarian affairs, or representing diplomacy overseas? Should it be deeper?
And when you walk into USAID for International Development, one of the first things you notice is a wall of individuals who've lost their lives as U.S. Foreign Service officers involved in development. And once a year, I stand in front of a room of hundreds and hundreds of people, and we read off the names of individuals working for U.S. nonprofit who have lost their lives doing the work that they have. And in doing that, it's sort of touching this reality that that as Americans, we engage globally through all sorts of different means, and that there are thousands of foreign service officers spending time overseas, that there are individuals and contractors, that there are individuals in nonprofits and so forth, that are the face of America. And we've negotiated with the Department of Defense in some of the hottest, most complex environments. The two types of American organizations that will run into each other are the special forces of the armed services and U.S. NGOs. And in those environments, how they work together, how we maintain separate lanes to do our respective roles, this type of U.S. engagement is critically important. And I think that we do it quietly and not known, but it is something that the American people need to necessarily, hopefully over time, recognize that it's in our own good to acknowledge these people.
And within the InterAction lobby, even there's a beautiful memorial for individuals who have made this sacrifice. Yes, it's very inspiring. And maybe if someone's listening who might be planning a July 4th gathering, a sporting event or some sort of event where, as I say, we rightfully recognize those who serve in the military and have them stand, but we also be mindful of maybe having those who have served in the Foreign Service or for NGOs and nonprofits also stand, who serve overseas. Peace Corps, those who have served in the Peace Corps, and it's the individuals from the U.S. and it's the partners we work with, because it's I remember being in Darfur and working with local Darfuri populations in terms of trying to feed 2 million people that have been displaced during a war. This willingness of individuals in the toughest of environments to help each other, to help individuals escape or to provide food or medical service and so forth. This sort of irony in the world's toughest, most difficult, most challenging environments, where you see some of the worst horrors, at the same time we see this dignity, this bravery, this courage of individuals from this country and others and locals willing to make sacrifices for the ideal that we can improve people's lives. And they then make a difference. And if that is possible, why not believe that we can do this, improve lives here at home or improve lives elsewhere, that this enterprise of improving human welfare is not something we should simply look away from and give up on. Any of you who may be listening who fit into the category of rendering this type of service overseas, whether young or old, please know that we honor you and honor your service, and especially at this holiday season. Sam, could I go back to that story that you were telling about the little girl in India as we draw to a close here? And I imagine and hope that she's a grown woman. She has found nourishment in life, spiritual nourishment, physical nourishment. She has found happiness. That can be our hope. And she really, as you poignantly described, taught you something lovely about service itself. What would you tell younger people now who might be interested in following sort of a line that you have gone in your career, but younger people who may be ready to go out and serve? How would you motivate them to do that as you think about that, again, the little girl in India? I
mean, one of the changes, then, is a very powerful change I've witnessed in my career, is that the ways that individuals can make a difference in the world are so varied now. There are individuals working within the private sector, different people working in the value chains of their companies, that the idea that there can be a purpose and positive impact to global capitalism, that one could do this through the military or through nonprofits or through foreign service or other ways of engagement or working with organizations overseas. The varied ways that one can engage are tremendous. But behind all this is a simple sense that, am I willing to push the boundaries of what is possible in a complex and messy world? Or am I going to have a narrative of saying, it's cynical, it's not possible, it's not my responsibility, let someone else do that? And the answer is, maybe this is not for everyone. But I have found that what the nicest thing of this type of career is not necessarily what one achieves in the world per se, but the gift that you get in return. In my case, a handful of peanuts. But that has been, I've seen that time and time again, that the true heroes of the improvement of human well-being are inevitably in the actual villages, in the slums, in the refugee camps, and other places, that you get to see and witness some amazingly powerful and beautiful human beings doing some good things that change lives, and that you are, in essence, a participant in that. And I can't think of a more meaningful way to spend one's career.
Thank you for listening to Clydebuilt Conversations from Clydebuilt International. Please visit us at clydebuiltnow.org. Thank you.